Readers, we can make some fascinating connections with everyday life, even in school. We need to think a little bit more about the problem that George is facing and how Hazel reacts to it. Think about the impact of the systematic problems on different characters. You may have noticed tiny details that tell a lot about characters, like the way Hazel says it would be nice to hear the different sounds. That's a lot of different options that we could think about. But let's read on. It'll be interesting to see if you find yourself thinking more about the same questions or if the text will suggest new directions to go in. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer, said George. I think it would be real interesting hearing all the different sounds, said Hazel, a little envious. All the things they think up. Said George. Only if I was handicapper general. You know what I would do, said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes. Kind of in honor of religion. I could think, if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make 'em real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else, said George. Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison. But a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood in the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed on the studio floor, were holding their temples. All of a sudden, you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa, so's you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. Take another minute to stop and jot. Pause the video and jot what you are thinking now. Are you starting to consider how George and Hazel are dealing with the power of the rules in this society? It's pretty fascinating. Before we go on, you might take a look back at your notes and see if there are things that you haven't considered yet that you should. What thinking work does this text want you to do? George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. You've been so tired lately. Kind of wore out, said Hazel. If there was just some way we could make a little hole in the bottom of the bag and just take out a few of them lead balls, just a few. 2 years in prison and $2,000 fine for every ball I took out, said George. I don't call that a bargain. If you could just take a few out when you came home from work, said Hazel. I mean, you don't compete with anyone around here. You just sit around. If I tried to get away with it, said George, then other people'd get away with it. And pretty soon, we'd be right back to the Dark Ages again, with everybody competing against everybody else. You wouldn't like that, would you? I'd hate it, said Hazel. There you are, said George. The minute people start cheating on laws, what do you think happens to society? If Hazel hadn't been able to come up with an answer to this question, George couldn't have supplied one. A siren was going off in his head. Reckon it'd fall all apart, said Hazel. What would? Said George blankly. Society, said Hazel, uncertainty. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. The television program was suddenly interrupted for a news bulletin. It wasn't clear at first as to what the bulletin was about, since the announcer, like all announcers, had a serious speech impediment. For about half a minute, and in a state of high excitement, the announcer tried to say, "Ladies and gentlemen." He finally gave up, handed the bulletin to a ballerina to read. "That's all right," Hazel said to the announcer. "He tried. That's the big thing. He tried to do the best he could with what God gave him. He should get a nice raise for trying so hard." Okay, take a minute to stop and jot what you're thinking now. Readers, were you trying to do some different work in this section? Wondering what led this world to go awry? It's fascinating, isn't it? It seems like there's really clear reasons why society went this way, and you may be wondering if it could be a good thing to find ways to make people less competitive or more equal, considering the positive reasons behind a society's rule. In the next video, we'll read on a bit further and see what new work comes up.